history of the Romanian, of the Museum of the Romanian Peasants during the last century, putting a focus on the pre-communist and the communist area and time, and then introducing briefly also the situation of the museum today. So Anca Maria Panoiu, she's a book editor and a translator. She's based in Bucharest, in Romania. Between 2015 and 2017, she has been an assistant curator at the Image Archive of the Museum of the Romanian Peasant, where she contributed to several cultural projects focused on the archive. And she also was an editor of Marta Jecu, anthropological journal of the institution. She holds an MA in cultural studies with a dissertation about what she calls naive museums in rural Romania. Her current interests span from oral history, documentary film, visual anthropology, and museology. So she's an expert in the archive, and her talk will be illustrated by images from the archive, and also in rurality and in museology. She's also fluent in the talk will be in English, but she's fluent in French, so if there are any questions afterwards, you can put them freely in French, and she will respond in French. And same for me and for the artists, so we can have even the discussion after in French. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for your presence. I'm glad to share with you some of my research interests in the Museum of the Romanian Peasant and its image archive. So, I'll just begin. The history of... do you hear me? Is it okay like this? Okay. The history of the actual Museum of the Romanian Peasant in Bucharest mirrors quite precisely the three main periods which define by and large the 20th century in Romania. The royal period, when it was the Museum of National Arts between 1906 and 1948, linked to the name of its founder, Alexandru Țigara Samocaș. Then followed the communist period, under the designation of Museum of Folk Art between 1948 and 1978, ruled by ethnographer Tancred Bănețeanu, and finally, the post-socialist one starting on the 5th of February 1990, when it was refounded as the Museum of the Romanian Peasant, conceived by artist Horia Bernea, in an attempt to recover the initial museum in a contemporary paradigm, being awarded the European Museum of the Year award in 1996. Well, what is interesting with this is that each age of the museum produced and nourished its own narratives around the image of the peasant. The display politics, the status and value given to the artifacts were influenced by what was at stake at a certain moment from a social and political point of view. I'll just start by outlining a short presentation of the image archive as it is nowadays, and then I'll begin my historical voyage. Well, the image archive of the Museum of the Romanian Peasants is the visual part of its greater ethnological archive, which was gathered throughout the institution's tormented existence of more than 100 years, and whose content covers the entire period of documentation of the institution. From its founding in 1906 by Alexandru Țigara Samocaș to the present day. The image archive was organized in its actual form during the late 1990s by visual anthropologist Ioana Popescu and her team in an attempt to structure in several funds and collections visual data spanning the entire history of the institution. As you can see, it comprises more than 70,000 items, varying in form and content, such as ancient photographs, photographic plates, negatives and slides, original and counted prints, film reels, and VHS from the fieldwork carried out by the museum team in the 1990s, and recent fieldwork material. Thus, considered from a historical perspective, The archive may be conceived as a multi-layered visual repository that bears witness to the representation of rurality in a veritable lieu de mémoire, in the words of ethnologist Marianne Benid, as throughout its existence, the museum was a symbol of the developing cultural scene in Romania, though in different ways according to the epoch. From this perspective, the statement of this lecture is that the representation of rurality has been instrumentalized at all epochs by different parties with their specific interests. This may have happened either through the framing of a peasant subject in the rectangle of an image, or through showcasing peasant material culture in an exhibition curated at the museum, as every epoch perceives rurality specifically according to its social context and political agenda. In Romania, the peasant was a strong figure to be profiled on the cultural canvas throughout the 20th century. Therefore, the Museum of the Romanian Peasant in Bucharest, together with its image archive, are to be analyzed employing an historical approach. So, my question is, how do visual remnants speak about the world pictured in their frames? And going even further, what can they tell us about the context in which a certain photograph was taken, about the political implications of the time, and about how these can influence perception, research, and most of all, curating nowadays? Well, now I'll just tell you how the image archive started, because the story is quite fascinating. The story of the initiation of the image archive is a genuine illustration for the statement I just made. It was 1997. The Museum of the Romanian Peasant had just been awarded the European Museum of the Year award a year before, and the institution had reached its climax on the Bucharest cultural stage as a vanguard museum attempting to recover the Museum of National Art, founded by Alexandru Țigălescu in 1906, though it made this through a contemporary post-communism parody. While preparing a photography exhibition on childhood, visual anthropologist Ioana Popescu came across a wooden box. This wooden box contained glass negatives, some of them with altered film or even broken. The vivid sights and the strong depiction of characters appealed to her, as they were both documentary and spectacular, bearing the stylistic mark of their authorship. You'll see who this man is. Nevertheless, there was a political conflict. According to the register, the wooden box was inherited from the archives of the Museum of the Communist Party, an institution which in 1948 had usurped the building housing Țigălescu museum soon after the installation of the communist regime in Romania, as will be detailed in the following. But the inventory record card stated clearly that the author of the photographic plates was Iosif Berman, a renowned interwar photographer who had played a strong part in the ambitious research on Romanian villages carried out by the Sociological School in Bucharest, led by sociologist Dimitrie Gusti in the interwar period, with royal funding. Moreover, these photographs often pictured scenery from the pre-communist epoch and even members of the royal family, which was totally in contrast to a recently established totalitarianism that aimed to erase each and every trace of the past, merely to do with the late democracy and royalty. While the deep reasons of such an acquisition by the Museum of the Communist Party are still partially shrouded in mystery, and would make a suitable subject for another dissertation, the newly discovered collection of photographic plates was fascinating enough for the team at the museum to aggregate a direction of visual anthropology and frame it as the image archive. And just in the following, I'll try to outline the history of the Museum of the Romanian Peasant and its intertwining with the image archive. Let's start by saying that in Romania, the 20th century can be divided into three main periods. The first is the royal one, up to 1947, under the reign of the Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen dynasty. Then there is a communist one, which was also totalitarian from 1947 to 1989, with leader Gheorghe Gheorghiu and dictator Nicolae Ceausescu as key figures. And then there is a post-socialist one after the revolution in December 1989, which marks the fall of Romanian communism and its transition to democracy. The institutional path of the actual Museum of the Romanian Peasant was strongly influenced by these three main periods, and thus it mirrors them quite precisely. As Ioana Popescu, the founder of the archive, states in an article she wrote in 2006, occasioned by the centenary of the institution. Ioana Popescu claims that the three major stages correspond to specific curatorial discourses, from the ethnographic and nationalist one, passing through the communist one, and finishing with the period after 1990. She defends the idea that the representation of rurality had to keep up with the political context of each period. Let us just unfold this tormented path with its ups and its downs. In 1906, the Museum of Ethnography, National, Decorative and Industrial Art, it has a very long name, was founded in Bucharest through a royal decree issued by His Majesty Carol I. Alexandru Țigai Samurcaș, you can see him in the photograph, was named its director. He was very special. He was known to be the only Romanian art historian to have completed a doctoral thesis in Munich. This was not unusual. This was not an unusual case in Europe at that time, because the old continent was witnessing a severe decline of the big empires, simultaneously with the declaration and ascent of national states. In that context, ethnographic museums proliferated in Europe as part of a larger political project which aims to aggregate and legitimate national identities. In Romania, this meant the fulfillment of some older intentions, namely a project that had intended to extend an existing museum of antiquities by adding the section of national costumes in 1875, and, mostly important, a project in 1901 whose idea stemmed from the Universal Exhibition in Paris, aiming to create a permanent exhibition of the genre. At that time, the population of Romania was mostly rural, which is why Romanian intellectuals considered that the representation of this domestic savage, the peasant, could have worked as an identity reservoir prone to stirring feelings of national attachment. For at that time, such a figure was as untamed as it was fascinating and incomprehensible. Therefore, its representations could be designed to fit certain aspirations. Thus, the peasant became a pawn in the elaboration of the political project of a nascent state. This project needed a set of values strong enough to claim a certain national specificity. Therefore, the figure of the peasant was turned into a model and was assigned virtues of wisdom, artistic talent, and an intimate fellowship with nature in its purest sense, nearly atemporal. The peasant was viewed as the one and only repository of certain moral and aesthetic values attached to the idea of being Romanian, and thus amassing and showcasing artifacts originating from peasant culture became a political gesture inscribed in the larger project of configuring a national identity. In the image, you can see the building of the museum. Its construction started in 1912. It is placed on Kiselev Road, Avenue in Bucharest. The project had been designed by the famous architect Nicolae Budești, specifically in order to house a national museum. And the works were to cover 26 years, as they were pursued throughout the First World War, as well as through many political and economic changes in the country. The architectural style chosen by Lipa Budești was not a matter of chance. Neo-Romanian, as it is called, or Brâncovenesc style, was part of the same political project of legitimizing a nation that was coming into existence. To picture these perspectives on the Romanian peasant in the early 20th century, let us come back to the archive and take a look at several photographs taken back then, extracted from the thousands that comprise this huge visual repository. This one is a typical example of photographic composition in the style of the period, which bears the signature of the Czech photographer Leopold Adler. While the characters, an old man and a girl spinning, seem to be actual peasants, as one can observe their harsh features and the dirt on their faces and hands, which would not be the case if they were models, their postures are nevertheless almost surely imposed by the person with the camera, as they do not look at him but elsewhere, seeming unaware of being photographed. The man is old and has a beard, a possible indicator for his wisdom. Moreover, the placing of the pair in the same frame may indicate an attempt to highlight gender relations in a world governed by patriarchy. The architectural details complete the traditional setting. Further on, the idea of tradition may be nuanced by looking at this image, which pictures a shepherd playing the pipe. This photograph may be given at least two interpretations. The first is related to the ideas about the peasant as a genuine figure leading a pure existence in a bucolic realm close to nature. The second may turn to a more documentary approach, as we can see the man in the complete attire of his occupation, surrounded almost pedagogically by the instruments of his daily labor and by architectural elements. Thus, here is a first example of looking at an image in two different ways that transmit each another meaning. Things are quite different in the case of the next two photographs, which are evidently studio photographs employing a model in order to represent rurality, but in a way that had more to do with an aspiration rather than with genuine reality. We can see the background and the decor and the studied posture of the characters, the flawless costumes and the overall setting aim to depict specific characteristics, but at the same time they make the setting almost untraceable in time and space, linking it to an undefined past. Maybe except for the tailoring and the ornaments of the costume, which may speak indeed to the connoisseur. But scenography was not at all unknown to the dwellers of the Romanian village themselves at the beginning of the 20th century. This photograph is one of my favorites because it is very rich in meaning. It has many layers of meaning, as we shall see in the following. Well, this image abounds in clues of what may have been either the unknown photographer's ideas on representing peasants or their own will of staging themselves for posterity. Apart from the rigorous organization of the visual field, which goes gradually from a near foreground to a far background, there is an interesting object, typical for peasant photographs at that time, that may stir many questions. This is a carpet, held by two other persons, one that can be seen on the left, and the other one who is somehow out of sight. Maybe because of the long exposure, the image is not so clear, but it is still there. Does the carpet function as a separator of context between the convention, or what deserves to be photographed, from genuine reality, which is undeserving, for it is thought to be ordinary? Was it borrowed from what peasants might have seen in the city, thus an urban visual quote? And most of all, did the characters in the foreground know that they were not the only ones to appear in the photograph, elegant as they were in their specific holiday attire? Or to put it differently, did the characters from behind the carpet know that they were being photographed, or was it just a trick of the person with the camera? Many hypotheses can be developed around the same visual artifacts, and in the context of employing such images in a museum discourse, they may open different, even opposite paths of interpretation. Leaving both the field and the studio, let us take a look at how rurality was represented during that time in the museum framework. Merely by arranging items of peasant culture in a new form, taken away from its original context, and rebuilt through intellectual endeavors, aiming to portray peasantry in a way that, at the same time, cannot be torn away from the ideology of the epoch. This is evident in these three images, as they highlight the ethnographic approach on peasant material culture in a classificatory way. From the very end of the 19th century, the ethnographic museums that were multiplying in Europe in the pursuit of creating national identities were aiming to reproduce a precise ethnographic reality and to display the exact artifacts and cultural settlements. The rigid scenic representation, in its imitation determined by scientific goals, eludes the vivid side of that culture and ends up by eluding time itself, turning it into a sign, as Jean Baudrillard puts it. Thus, by decontextualizing objects, the links between them get weakened and they are more prone to be reassembled in a display that follows a curatorial statement rather than speaking for themselves. In these images, this is to be seen in at least three ways. Firstly, the marks that depict the museum framework, for instance the label and the string. Secondly, the agglutination of objects stemming from different registers, which in their original context would almost surely not be put together. Thirdly, the unsubtle juxtaposition of peasant artifacts and instruments from the museum toolkit, such as showcases or paintings, in which the intellectual construction of the time speaks for itself. But there is also an exception, and I love this exception. The house of peasant Antonio Mogos from Chaulu could make an exception at least from a certain point of view. The house was brought by Alexandru Țigară Samurcaș during the epoch of the Royal Museum. The director returned from a fieldwork research accompanied by the proprietor himself, a peasant from the village of Chaulu, Gorj County. Not only did the man sell the old house to the museum, but he came to Bucharest in order to assemble it in one of the exhibition spaces in the building on Kiselev Road. Given his organic link to the house, this gesture, together with the presence of the man in flesh and bones, lent some organicity to the approach otherwise meant to depict specific ethnographic items. This particular artifact, the house, may serve as well as a bridge between the three ages of the museum, as it was present throughout its entire history, though in different ways. While during the royal period it became a focus in the museum for the elite of the time, during the communist era it was moved to the village museum and left unattended, only to degrade in open air. Finally, during the late 1990s, it was brought back to its original place, as it is to be detailed later. Further on, the national art genre is to be encountered even within the context of the research carried out by the sociological school in Bucharest. The particularity of this image resides in the fact that it is actually a photograph in a photograph, thus some kind of postmodern approach. While the traditional setting at the core of this image remains unaltered, as you can see the peasants in their garments, the fact of framing its context tells us more about the documenting of the act of photography rather than about its mere subject. It was the interwar period and mentalities were shifting. Soon, the political regime was shifted to imposing a different ideology and different staging approaches. The denouement of World War II meant the installation of the communist regime for Romania, which in turn brought the lifetime project of Alexandru Țigară Samurcaș to an end. In 1948, the title of the institution changed to the Museum of Folk Art, or of the Socialist Republic of Romania. On an ideological level, this meant a radical change in discourse. The interests of the newly established totalitarianism could only be served by the image of an impoverished peasant, exploited by noblemen and pushed to the margins of society. The new communist working class was to aggregate from this very mass of people, defining the victorious figure of a new era, as messianic as utopian, built by communists on the ruins of a past world. Thus, comparing the two epochs, we can see that the representations of the peasant proved to be a mold for two opposite discourses that came one after another during the 20th century. On the one hand, the nationalist discourse exalted the image of a peasant who was at the same time an artist and an icon of moral values, whilst idealized at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th, the peasant was afterwards objectified and his culture was thoroughly researched during the modernization of Romanian village in the interwar period. One of the leading approaches of this process was the documenting campaigns carried out by the sociological school in Bucharest, led by Dimitrie Gusti. On the other hand, the communist discourse changed to presenting the image of a peasant enslaved by noblemen, and promised him salvation. Nevertheless, it actually altered their culture irreparably by means of collectivization and hasty acculturation determined by forced urbanization. Thus, as communist propaganda created an oppressed peasant as the ideal mold for the newly formed working class, the institution was occupied by recent rulers and followed the new discourse closely under the designation of Museum of Folk Art. Practically speaking, the communist elite usurped all the posh districts from the north of Bucharest, installing their residences on the locations of the former royal bourgeoisie. The palace on Șoseaua Kiselev was no exception. In 1954, the ethnographic collections were moved to Știrbei Palace on Calea Victoriei 107, the headquarters for the new Folk Art Museum whose discourse was prone to serve the ideology of the party. The existence of this institution under the directorship of Tancred Bonațanu spanned from 1948 to 1978. In 1978, there was a so-called fusion with the Museum of Village. In fact, what happened then was that the Folk Art Museum was packed up in boxes, and so it vanished. All through this epoch, the palace on Șoseaua Kiselev housed a propaganda museum of the communist regime that was to last until 1989. But, beyond historic landmarks, the actual shift from the royal epoch to the communist one may sometimes take the form of a fusion rather than a rigid boundary. There were people who lived and created art during both times, having to adapt their work to the discourses which were at stake. An elucidating example in this sense is the work of photographer Aurel Bauch, who worked in Paris as well. A renowned artist in Paris and a key figure of the sociological school in Bucharest. During his Dâmbovnic campaigns in 1939, he took a photograph of an old man, which he then published in 1940 in April in a national tourism magazine, with a caption reading, "Peasant from Argeș." Argeș is a mountain in Romania. A month later, the same photograph was published in a literary magazine in Romania, bearing his signature on the cover, as well as a caption, "Peasant Portrait." 15 years later, though, in 1955, thus several years after the establishment of communism, we find Aurel Bauch exhibiting the same negative at the photography exhibition Our Country, but with another title. This was Furrow from Furrow, which, as curator Viviana Jacob assumes, could be a play of words suggesting the connection between deep wrinkles and hard work. This is the work ideology of the Communist Party. Exhibited in the same context was another photograph which is to be found nowadays in the Image Archive. This one, it is called On Our Way to Healing. Though this is also thought to have been taken during the same interwar campaigns, the different title and different context of exhibiting it shift the focus on the idea of hard work, prone to fit the new ideology. Again, as the same curator puts it, in 1955 these titles were a means to publish and exhibit works from an undesirable period reflecting a problematic intellectual history of the communist regime. Through them, Aurel Bauch reinvents his work for the new political context. But the communist representation of reality had also its laboratory side. This had absolutely nothing to do with peasant rituals or traditional holidays, which were replaced by a newly created pantheon comprising key communist figures, together with their own purely secular rituals, depicted in an artistic and competitive way. In the two images on the left, there are shown such aspects from an art contest patronized by the oversized portrait of Stalin as the presence of a benefactor whom everyone should look up to. But there are other types as well, taken during the same period. For instance, these images, are ambivalent. The one with the girl was taken in 1957, thus in full communist period. On the one hand, it may be interpreted as picturing symbols of hard work. Let us not forget that the sickle is half of the international communist symbol, and then the riches of the country, the golden wheat. But on the other hand, considering the close-up, one cannot but notice the free posture, the unfaked smile, and the sparkling youthfulness of the character, specific to a snapshot, which may escape the aims of an explicit instrumentalization. What else could be said about the other photograph, taken by Tancred Bonațanu himself in Vaș, in northern Romania? In 1964, it is as vivid as life. Such examples highlight the fact that even in the midst of totalitarianism, not each and every fieldwork enterprise followed the path of ideology. The fall of communism in Romania, after the revolution in December 1989, was a landmark for a new age of the museum. On the 5th of February 1990, Andrei Pleșu, who was then new Minister for Culture, signed the Refoundation Act for the former Museum of Alexandru Țigara Samocaș in the recently recovered building, naming Horia Bernea as the director. The project for the new museum had as a main guideline to establish a continuity with the former institution, the one before the decades of communism. Nevertheless, the way to achieve this was fundamentally different from the nationalist direction adopted at the beginning of the 20th century. The painter Horia Bernea conceived of a link with Romanian traditional culture based on spiritual grounds, mostly on the Christian Orthodox faith. But the peasant figure he was picturing was not reduced to being Romanian in a nationalist sense, as in the former times, for incarnating national specificities would no longer respond to the contemporary sensibilities of the public. The traditional man pictured in the approach of Horia Bernea and his team represented the entire area of Southern Europe in an attempt to retrieve the European unity in pre-schismatic Christian values. You can see the team of the museum, Horia Bernea and 3 anthropologists who helped him closely to conceive the museum. Well, and symmetrical to this endeavor of establishing cultural and spiritual continuities was a certain subtle militancy of the new museology in relation to the former communist regime, intended to highlight its failure. The means chosen to do so was to build the permanent exhibition opened up to the public on Easter Sunday 1993 around the symbol of the cross. Why the cross? Because its leitmotif figured in the museum both as a structural and as a cultural principle, of the traditional world, functioned as a militant symbol against half a century of atheist political regime and was thus a sign of the barricade, of the fight against the ghosts of communism. Even though this exorcism was nothing but a metaphor, as it assailed the former regime only indirectly, its effect in the recent post-socialist context was extremely powerful, as it hoisted a cultural and spiritual symbol that had been forbidden for almost 50 years. An elucidating example in this sense is the Fast Hall in the museum, an installation inspired by the underground churches of early Christianity. Starting in 1997, this subtle militancy was increased by another enterprise, this time stemming more from a political and historical paradigm, aimed to incriminate outrightly the crimes of the communist regime against Romanian peasantry. The whole Chuma, the pest political installation, was a metaphorical, still vivid setting that employed the ugly and the dissonant in order to picture the communist epoch. It displayed huge portraits of the rulers Dej and Stalin, typical of the propaganda of the period. Small statues of Lenin reiterated ad nauseam and painted in red for diabolical connotations. Copies of the Scantea newspaper, this can be translated the Spark, glued everywhere on the walls as an interminable incantation of propaganda. The hammer and sickle painted obsessively on a tormenting red background, and fragments of counterfeited folklore or caricatures of the epoch representing the nobleman as diabolical and in exchange exalting the figure of the peasant working zealously on the common property of the state. All of these were intended to articulate a museological installation, an orchestration of the hideous, sinister, and diabolical with the aim of maintaining a memory. Well, in the following I'll just try to speak about the museum nowadays because several shifts have been, well, at stake from the 1990s and years 2000s. So, however interesting and challenging one may find Horia Berna's museological discourse, when speaking of it, the past tense should be employed. At the time when I'm writing these lines, the permanent exhibition, as it was conceived and set up by the artist and his team during the 1990s, has ceased to exist. The halls of the museum are empty, for during the last 3 years, the building has undergone consolidation works that demanded that the exhibition bearing the signature of Horia Berna be uninstalled. And even though the works are now completed, institutional issues that are mostly shrouded in political and administrative noise still keep the exhibition from being either reinstalled or reconceived. The hugest challenge in this respect is to propose a curatorial statement that can replace the powerful of the Berna exhibition. The Berna exhibition is either loved or hated, but no one until nowadays has elevated to such expectations in order to be able to replace it and to put forward something that can really challenge it. As for the archive, even though it is not exempt from the same institutional flaws or from the lack of elementary funds for pursuing its daily activity of preserving and salvaging visual artifacts, it has nevertheless flourished during the last 4 years. A young and vital team has embraced the approach of opening it up for the public, designing participatory programs and cultural projects such as guided tours, performative exhibitions, screenings and workshops that go hand in hand with the slow but steady endeavor of researching the visual collections. The most recent outcome of this enthusiastic labor is the online platform Rețelele Privirii. This can be translated as the network of gaze. This is an attempt to curate some of the content of the archive by uploading it online in order to stir a participatory experience and even a documenting of the collections. We're reaching the end. Let me just draw out some conclusions of this lecture. The image archive and its intertwining with the history of the actual museum of the Romanian peasant could span hundreds of pages and innumerable hours of passionate debate. Looked at carefully, each and every photographic plate, slide or contact print can either speak for itself or trace and unfold some of the context in which it was produced, together with the features of the epoch, imprinted on the visual artifacts in different ways, from its mere materiality to the choice of representing one facet or another of a given reality. But, as the departure point of this expose was that the representation of a reality cannot be separated from the political or cultural intentions behind it, one more thing must be added. Often, the mere gaze of the one who looks at a visual artifact may be influenced by his or her own ideas on the subject, which in turn may be linked either to ideological issues or personal sensibilities. The very process of archiving does not escape from this, which is particularly interesting in the sense that registering and describing visual artifacts should mean their elucidation, the creation of a context, and thus the nourishing of a memory. It is the case with this image, which is very challenging. It depicts 4 characters in a rural setting, probably considering their garments and architecture, probably it's the beginning of the early 20th century. The characters are a woman, a man of color, and another man holding a child in his arms. Nevertheless, when we looked at the description of this photograph in the register, in the archive, we only found a description that reads, "In front of a gate, a bearded old man holds a child in his arms." Not a single word about the woman or about the African man, who, we have to admit this, in those times must have been an unusual appearance in Romanian villages, to say the least. And I'm just opening up a question. Might the archivist have neglected their presence on purpose? One can never tell because the register description was written back in the 1950s and the context of registering remains unknown. But what can be drawn from such an example is that even apart from social and political interests, the gaze itself is not innocent, and the act of giving meaning is first and foremost in the eye of the beholder. Thank you so much for listening. Et à la fin, je voudrais vous présenter cette image. Il s'agit d'une toile qui était pendue sur la porte de la plus petite salle du musée du paysan romain. C'était la salle Temps qui proposait un discours sur la manière traditionnelle de concevoir le temps. Et cette porte était toujours fermée. Et cette toile disait oser. Les gens qui vraiment osaient y entrer n'étaient pas nombreux. C'était comme un défi du musée pour le visiteur. Donc, oser ouvrir la porte parce qu'au-delà de la porte, c'est le temps.
For your talk and for all the work that was behind all this rigorous documentation work. So if you have any questions, please. You can have, yes, we can also continue with maybe screening for the resting time or the installation of Nicu to profit a bit more. Because in the installation of Nicu, the composition of images it's random, so it always creates new compositions. So it's interesting to write it down longer. Yes.
English, okay, but I don't. I can write that.
I was wondering about the last period you were portraying and the fact that Panoiu had like a sort of a lycée d'auteur, no?
Sorry, can you please repeat because I'm not hearing you.
Can you hear me?
Not so well. This is why. Please speak more slowly.
Alright. I was saying about the last part of the last period you were picturing. I wondered if because of Panoiu's design, musée d'auteur, no? De quelque manière, like a very personal interpretation.
Yes.
In your opinion, it should be reconstructed as such, as part of the historic accumulation of layers, or you think that there should be a completely new display, including this part as a sort of another element that came in history, but with another vision?
Well, this is the hugest question in Romania nowadays related to the museum, because everyone is just wondering whether something continuing Berna's exhibition should be reinstalled, or if, on the other hand, it should be replaced. Well, I think that either ways are possible on the condition that a new exhibition would suit the mentality nowadays, because the symbol of the cross and the subtle militancy against communism was available in the context of years 1990. This discourse wouldn't fit the expectations of the public nowadays. So either the exhibition of Berna should be taken as I don't know, as a landmark, but continue differently, in a way that suits nowadays horizons. Either something so powerful that can challenge it should be made. Either way, but on the condition that it suits nowadays expectations. This is what I think. But how? I couldn't say.
I was also reading some critique of this museum saying that in fact Horia Benes created a museum that ended up being called a national museum, a national museum for a national representation of the peasant. But in fact it was a personal museum, so it continues to be a national museum. So I think this is an ambiguity that maybe should be used.
Yes, but the word national in the title has more to do with bureaucracy than with the dictatorial statement. It is nowadays, the word Romanian is much more... yes. Well,
all these words.
Yeah, but they are very powerful in many ways. Yes, I agree with the fact that it is a personal interpretation, but it is a very assumed one. It is a personal interpretation out of many other interpretations that could be made. It suited that time. Nowadays, I don't know what else could be.
Est-ce que vous pourriez définir ce que seraient les attentes actuelles?
Ce serait assez difficile en fait, parce que il y a beaucoup de bruit institutionnel autour de ce musée. D'une part, c'est le mythe Bernin, le fait que son expo, sa manière de la concevoir a été si connue et admirée pendant les années 1990. De l'autre côté, c'est le fait que, en fait, maintenant, rien ne passe là-bas et le public a aucune idée sur ce qui se passe. C'est ça. Il y a une attente parce qu'il n'y a pas de transparence, en fait, de transparence institutionnelle. C'est ça qui se passe. Voilà. Tout le monde attend que le musée soit ouvert de nouveau, mais personne ne sait quand ça sera et comment, et c'est ça.
Quand je disais attente actuelle, c'était la traduction de expectation. applications, décidé qu'il faudrait que ça puisse, qu'aujourd'hui,
oui, je comprends.
la présentation actuelle devrait cadrer, devrait correspondre à un contexte contemporain.
Dans ce sens, oui. Oui, merci. Merci pour, oui, merci pour nuancer la question. Je pense qu'il devait s'agir d'une approche plutôt anthropologique sur le paysan, probablement sociologique, dans le fait que les limites sont assez floues aujourd'hui, avec la globalisation et la migration et tout ça. En Roumanie, une très grande partie des paysans font la migration pour travailler, afin de travailler. Donc on ne peut pas parler, on ne peut plus parler d'un paysan dans son environnement. Il y a toujours cette migration, cette façon de bouger, de ne pas avoir des marges. Et une attente dans ce sens devrait illustrer ce type de paysan qui n'est plus le paysan qu'on connaît, mais il est une forme difficile à saisir. L'approche, je pense que devrait être assez documentaire, peut-être, mais de nouveau, c'est une interprétation parmi d'autres possibles.
Parce que le musée, là vous parlez de ce que serait aujourd'hui le paysan roumain actuel, qui donc n'existe peut-être pas, ou pas de la même manière que c'était le cas au début du siècle, ou même dans les années 90. Mais le musée, c'est avant tout peut-être un ensemble d'objets qui existent toujours.
Les objets paysans dans le musée, oui, en fait, pas. Non,
enfin, une collection, il y a une collection.
Il y a une collection, oui, mais les objets sont anciens. Les paysans, dans les villages aujourd'hui, il n'y a plus, les gens n'utilisent plus ce genre d'objets. Donc, voilà. C'est une histoire du passé.
Voilà, donc ma question, en tout cas, ce serait comment aujourd'hui présenter ces objets qui existent, une collection qui est constituée d'objets datant du début du siècle jusqu'à quand, d'ailleurs, je ne sais pas trop, et jusqu'à quand ces objets ont été collectés. Et la deuxième aspect de la question, ce serait est-ce que la collecte se poursuit? Est-ce que la collection du musée continue d'être augmentée d'objets actuels?
Je n'ai pas des informations très précises en ce sens de la collecte, mais je peux vous raconter un peu des initiatives, même pendant les années 2000, 1990 et 2000, de Irina Nicolaou, la collaboratrice de Rodia Belna, qui elle aimait beaucoup surprendre la vie contemporaine du village. Et elle a initié vraiment une collecte des objets, objets villageois et aussi objets urbains de la contemporanéité. Et elle a fait une collection, mais l'état de cette collection n'est pas très visible, n'est pas très organisé. Donc on ne peut pas parler d'une collecte bien gérée et articulée. Ce sont des initiatives, des petites initiatives, mais que ça. Voilà. Okay, thank you. Merci beaucoup.